Hey, welcome back to the Métropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today, we're starting a new video series focusing on deck building, and particularly deck building when it comes to the new player experience. This here is System Gateway. You're probably pretty familiar with it. This has been out since 2021. Null Signal Games put this thing out, and still to date, it is by far the best way to learn Netrunner that we've ever had in the history of the game. It's kind of incredible. When you pick up System Gateway, it does come with two pre-constructed decks, the Catalyst versus the Syndicate. And while these decks are by no means legal constructed decks in largely any format besides Learn to Play, they're really good at teaching you how to play the game. And once you've played that matchup enough times and added the booster cards that teach you some more complex mechanics, once you've mastered that matchup, Catalyst versus the Syndicate, you're actually expected to take the Catalyst and the Syndicate and put them aside, deconstruct the pre-constructed decks, and then with the 75 cards that you have available for you in System Gateway, you're expected to go off and build your first ever runner deck and your first ever corporation deck, and hopefully experience your first ever true game of Netrunner. This is both a very exciting time, but also obviously a very daunting time. The game of Netrunner is already pretty complicated and pretty hard to learn sometimes, but doing deck building on top of that can be a bit much. But that's okay, because in this video series, we're going to be focusing on exactly that point in time. We have just picked up System Gateway. We've retired the Catalyst and the Syndicate. Let's build our first ever decks. In this video, we're going to be building our first ever corporation deck. And of course, this is not only about building the deck itself. We're going to be explaining all our thoughts, choices, and how we ended up on the deck that we ended up. And very specifically too, we are going to be explaining some best practices, some guidelines, some prevailing wisdoms, the sort of stuff that I wish I learned when I was learning to deck build for the very first time many, many moons ago. Now, specifically this video, I'm worried it's going to be a bit long. There are timestamps in the time bar below, so feel free to jump ahead. But because I'm expecting this to be your first foray into constructed deck building, we are going to make sure to go over some of the rules and the requirements when it comes to building a deck. Whether that's deck size, agenda points, influence, all that sort of stuff, which might be the first time you've ever seen it, considering this is our first deck building exercise. I will make sure that we're going to go through all of that sort of stuff so we're all on the same page. Again, if you understand how that stuff works, just jump over it in the timestamp. But again, if you know nothing about deck building, this is exactly where you want to start. We'll be going over everything. And by the end of this video, we'll have a great corporation deck to start. Now, two things quickly before we dive in. The first thing is at any point in time during this video, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them in the YouTube comments. I really like answering questions, that if you have the question, probably someone else does too. And I want to use the space again to make sure we're all as comfortable with this game as we can be. So please ask, I will definitely answer. Secondly, you just want to take a second to like the video. If you appreciate this sort of content, it really does help the channel grow on YouTube. It's greatly appreciated. And with that, let's dive in to System Gateway and build our first ever Corporation Netrunner deck and focus on some strong fundamentals. Now, we're going to be doing some deck building. Now, we're going to be doing that deck building online. This is a website. It's called NetrunnerDB. It's been around for a long time, over a decade. It started out as a community project. At this point, this website is maintained by Null Signal Games, and I cannot recommend it enough. Not only has this been a fantastic community space for a long time where you can build your decks, you can also share decks online and get feedback. You can see what a lot of other people around the world are doing. There's reviews, there's a card gallery. It's a fantastic website, and it's been around for a really long time for some really great reasons. Now, I'll be teaching you how to use this website. Again, NetrunnerDB.com, link in the description. It's just the name in the top left corner. But I actually think it's a really good website to build your first Netrunner deck. And that is specifically because there are a bunch of things you have to worry about when building your first Netrunner deck. When it comes to things like making sure your deck size is legal and your influence, and there's a bunch of things you have to worry about. And the great thing about NetrunnerDB is that it always warns you. It basically has guardrails. And anytime you do something that's not kosher, it'll say something. And so you cannot leave this website with an illegal deck without knowing that you've made some sort of mistake on purpose or on accident. It will warn you. So I think as a newer player, to be able to offload some of that overhead, it's a really nice place to start your deck building because, again, there's some great guardrails here. It'll keep you on track. You just need to make an account. It's entirely free. I don't even think there's email verification, but once you made an account, we can dive right in. Now, what kind of deck are we building today? What I find incredibly impressive is that there's only 41 Corp cards, I believe, in System Gateway. And across these 41 Corp cards, you can actually make a couple archetypes of different corporation decks that are pursuing a win condition in different ways. Whether it's trying to make damage totally lethal and a problem for the runner, whether it's trying to make tags super relevant, or whether you're just trying to score points in a remote server and get to 7. I think System Gateway, for being as small as a card pool as it is, actually does support a lot of different strategies. And today, because it is our first ever corporation deck build, we are going to be focusing on fundamentals. So understanding that we're going to be trying to build a corporation deck that wins Netrunner in the way that you might expect a corporation to win a game of Netrunner. We're going to be scoring 7 points of agendas behind ice in a remote server, probably with some defensive upgrades. So just keep that in mind. I think it's important to understand what kind of deck we're going to build. We're going to be building some of the more wacky stuff maybe in the following videos, but for right now, we're going to try to build the fundamental corporation that just wants to get 7 points, which I promise you is still pretty fun, as boring as that sounds compared to the word damage. But with that, let's start building. So the tab you want to go to here is in the top left. It's called My Decks, and this will open up the page that will show you all the decks you have built. Now, if you built a new account, this page looks entirely different. I think it says wait, no decks or something like that across the top. My page will show that I already have a couple decks built here. And anytime that you build and save a deck on NetrunnerDB, it'll show up here. So you can open it, you can view it, you can edit it, you can duplicate it. So once we're done today, we'll have our first corporation deck in here. I believe a new account defaults to no decks existing pre-made. Now, the first thing we want to do is build a corporation deck. So we'll hit that button there. Now, this page opens up. And this is a kind of daunting page in some ways. We're going to try to get through this page quickly because it's asking us a very important question. It's a question you might not have been asked yet, which is, what's your identity? It's asking us to choose our identity. This is a really exciting concept and one of the central points of factional-based Netrunner deck building, and something that might be new to us if we've only played, again, the Catalyst versus the Syndicate. So when we played the Catalyst versus the Syndicate, our corporation was a syndicate, and it was this card here. This was our identity card. And while this card only contained a nice piece of art and a bit of flavor text, all this card functionally did was exist on the table to show the runner where HQ was. Run this. That's all it did. It didn't have any gameplay relevance besides being a marker to show where the server was. And once you play factional constructed Netrunner, that really changes. Your identity choice is incredibly important because you get to pick which corporation do you want to be. And this is largely 2 choices. The first choice is which of the 4 mega corporations do you want to be? In the lore of Netrunner, there are 4 major mega corporations, HB, Jinteki, NBN, and Wayland, and they all do very different stuff in the world of Netrunner. If I'm not mistaken, within System Gateway, there should be a little information card that tells you a bit about each of the corporations and how they handle, how they make their money, what they do, their strengths and their weaknesses. That's going to be a bit outside of the scope of this video. I'm not going to introduce all the factions. I do have a whole series on the channel where I go through all the System Gateway cards and explain the factions and what they do. You can watch that if you want more information. But your faction choice is really important because when you choose to be an NBN deck, your opponent understands that most of the cards in your deck are going to be NBN cards. This is very different than the Syndicate. When you played the Catalyst or the Syndicate, it was just a melange of different cards from all the different factions. And when you do factional-based constructed Netrunner, you have to be a bit more focused. So again, if we want to be a Jinteki deck like Restoring Humanity, a lot of our deck is going to be Jinteki cards, and there'll be a few cards that we bring in from other factions. But this is a very important distinction because, again, if you build an HB identity deck, your deck is mostly going to be HB cards. So that's our first choice, is which are the factions we want to be. And you notice here also within each faction, there's a bunch of different identities. So here currently, and the filter we're looking at shows us a lot of different cards, is that there's a bunch of different HB identities. And you'll notice each of these HB identities has different text on the card itself. Each of these corporations does something different. Now, System Gateway comes with 4 different corporations, 1 for each of the factions. Unfortunately, on this page, there's no way to sort, from my understanding, to just see the System Gateway identities. The best I can do is if I hit Control F or Command F and you do System Gateway, you can kind of jump between the 4 by just doing a search function. Again, there's 1 for each faction, so that's nice. There's 4 of them. But this page will show you 30 identities instead of 4. And the reason is that this filter is showing you the standard format. Netrunner has different formats for organized play. Standard is the most popular format. It's a very large format too. It currently encompasses the last 7 years of Netrunner products, both Fantasy Flight games and Null Signal games. And so there's a lot more choices, not just the 4 in System Gateway. It's like 30 across a couple years of Netrunner's history. Now, again, no way to show just the System Gateway cards. You can sort through them, but System Gateway has 1 for each of the different factions. So our choice is basically which faction do we want to play, because whatever faction we choose, we only have 1 choice of identity within the faction. Now today, because we want to build a deck that scores to 7 points, I think a great place to start here is Haas-Bioroid Precision Design. Precision Design, or as a lot of people call it, PD, is the HB identity, the Haas-Bioroid identity in System Gateway. And it's just really good, and it incentivizes you to score out agenda points. Now I'll go into more detail and explain why we chose this exactly. I just want to pick this identity to get off this page because this page is the most overwhelming it's going to be through this entire process because we have to look at, 29 other cards that you might not know what they are because of the bigger card pool. So I'm just going to click on this to pick precision design, and this will open the deck building page. Very important to understand. The identity that we have chosen, we can change later on in the deck building process. We are not married to the identity choice. We're not even married to the faction choice. So halfway through this deck building, if we decide, let's just make it a Wayland deck, we can change it. We don't have to build an entirely new deck. So your choice on that last page is honestly not that important, which is why we're going to try and get through that fast enough. But otherwise, welcome. This is the NetrunnerDB deck building page that you're going to get pretty used to because we're going to be spending most of our time on a page that looks like this. And just to explain how this works, the page is largely divided in two halves, left and right. On the left hand of the page, that's where our deck is displayed. And currently we have no cards in our deck, which is why we have that big empty space here in the middle. At the top here, this is our identity. So this is the corporation we chose to embody. It's a Haas-Bioroid identity. It has a bunch of text and numbers on it. We'll explain how that works in a second. But anytime that you see the name of a card in that sort of like blue text, if you click on it, not only do you get that highlight if you hover over it, if you click on it, you get this page that shows you the full card art. And then on the right side of the screen, it'll show you the most modern card text for any reason if that's different than what's on the card. Now underneath here, it gives us some information about the deck that we're building. And currently, you notice how some of this stuff is in red. That's because our deck is not legal right now. We got some problems. We're below minimum deck size. We don't have enough agenda points. It's very obvious. And this is one of my favorite things about building your first deck on NetrunnerDB is that it'll remind you if something is not right. And currently things are not right, which is not a surprise. We have no cards in our deck, but this is something that will be updated in real time. And once we're done our deck, all this stuff will be in white because we did a great job. Everything is perfect. Now again, this blank space here, this is where we're going to be adding cards to add to our deck. And currently there's nothing in our deck. Now on the right side of the screen, this is the card browser. And just to show you really quickly, this is a card. We don't know what this card is, but if I click the number on the left of the card, it'll add that many copies to the deck. And the idea is that the more copies of cards we own, this will get, populated. And this is where our deck will show up. And when we're finished, we'll have a whole deck there. For now, I'm just going to hit 0. Obviously, let's get those out of there. Now, really quickly, this is very important we do this. Is notice here, I'm seeing a lot of different cards. These are cards that don't exist in System Gateway, and that's because I mostly build decks in the standard format. As I mentioned earlier, standard is a larger format that encompasses the last 7 years of Netrunner. It's a popular format, but we don't want to look at 7 years worth of cards. We just want to look at the 41 Corp cards in System Gateway. So when you go to this collection tab at the top right, this is basically saying the collection we want the card browser to interact with, and we want it just to be System Gateway. I'm not sure what the default is when you make a new account. There's a chance that it is already only System Gateway, but just in case it's not, open up the collection tab. You want to hit the none button to deselect all of the possible options of all the cards that have ever existed, and then just hit System Gateway. Now, once we go back to the build tab, you'll notice instead of showing like 13 different HB agendas, it only shows me one because there's only one in System Gateway, and it's a really good one. Now, finally, I just want to bring this up to future-proof this video, and this topic can get a bit awkward to both explain and also to reckon with, but if you scroll down on the left side of the page here, underneath where you name your Corp deck, and we will name this before we're finished, there's a drop-down menu here that lets you pick your ban list. This probably will default to the last modern standard ban list. Here it's 2409. Otherwise, if you click on this drop-down menu, there's options for older ban lists and even startup ban lists. What's important to understand is that standard is the most popular format in Netrunner, citation needed, but it is the format where the World Championship happens in, for example, and it encompasses the last 7 years or so of Netrunner products, including System Gateway. What this means is if we have standard ban list 2409 active here, say that there was a card in System Gateway that was banned on the 2409 ban list, which says you can't play this in organized play. That card, we won't be able to find it in the card browser. Because we are saying we want to respect the standard 2409 ban list. And again, if card X is banned on this ban list, we just won't be able to find it. So you have to keep that in mind. Because currently, as of November 2024, where I'm recording this video, all of the cards in System Gateway on the corporation side and even the runner side are legal in the standard card pool. None of these cards have been banned yet. They've been around for 3 years. They're not banned. Now, all I'm saying is that there's a chance in the future that say a card like Luminal Transubstantiation could be banned. And if it is banned and you have this for your recent ban list, you're just not going to find it here. So if you want to make sure that you're going to see always all the cards in System Gateway, if you just hit the casual button here, it says, I don't care what the ban list is currently going on right now, just show me all the cards. And that will not change the card pool as of November 2024 for System Gateway. There's a chance in the future it will. And so you have to make a decision here that if you hit this button, you will make a deck that works in System Gateway against your friend who's also playing System Gateway. But if you also want to build a deck that you can bring to a local meetup that is respecting the standard format, you probably don't want to have the casual button on. Doesn't matter right now. Could matter in the future. And I still think at the end of the day, if you show up to your local game night and everyone's playing the standard format and you show up with a System Gateway deck that has a banned card for some reason in it, everyone's going to say, oh, sick, welcome to the game. And they really won't care. So do keep that in mind. I'm not No Signal Games organized play policy, but at the end of the day, you have to make a decision here. Right now, the decision doesn't matter because all the cards in System Gateway are still legal and standard. But in theory, hitting this button will make sure you see every card in System Gateway. If that does matter in the future, it does not now. Sorry about that. That's future proofing. Just keep that in mind. This will keep you on track. All right, with that out of the way, we can start talking about some deck building. And we're going to start on a really high level, I suppose. And that is just to make sure we understand that every card in System Gateway belongs to a faction. Those are largely the 4 major corporation factions. And so, for instance, this is an operation called Seamless Launch, and Seamless Launch is an HB faction card, a Haas-Bioroid card. And you can tell because it has the HB logo in the bottom left corner, it has in the watermark, and if you can see color, it's also very much quite purple. Now, of course, all the different factions have different cards and they just look the same idea, slightly different. This is Public Trail. It's an NBN card. You can tell because of the yellow and of course, all the logos and the watermarks and all that sort of stuff. That's important to understand. Now, there are also truly neutral cards. This is Hedge Fund. You'll notice that there's no corporation logos anywhere on it. That's all in white and it's a clean background. This belongs to no faction, which means functionally it belongs to all factions. So understanding that cards belong to certain factions is a very important part with deck building because specifically we are playing Haas-Bioroid precision design. We're playing an HB identity. You can tell we're playing an HB identity because it has, well, firstly, it does have the Haas-Bioroid name in the title. It's worth noting not every Haas-Bioroid identity starts by saying Haas-Bioroid. Some of them do, but not all do. But importantly, we have the HB logo in the top left corner and in the watermark. This is an HB identity. And important, your choice of faction when it comes to your identity is going to have a big restriction on what cards you can play in your deck. So specifically, our HB deck is allowed to play every HB card, so cards like Seamless Launch, we can play those, and every neutral card, so cards like Hedge Fund, we can play all of those. We will be able to play a small amount of cards from the other major factions, so NBN cards and Wayland cards, but largely the HB deck is expected to be playing mostly HB cards and neutral cards. This is really important to understand. Say that we're a runner and we sit down from our opponent and our opponent shows up with an NBN deck. We can guess that the majority of their deck will have NBN cards in it, and understanding what NBN does, its strengths and weaknesses, we'll have an idea of what that match is probably going to look like and what we should be doing as the runner running into an NBN corporation. So your faction choice is really important because it has a big impact on deck building. Generally, every corporation can play all of the cards in its own faction and then always all the neutral cards. So that's a very important thing to know. Secondly, differently than the Syndicate, which we played when we did our Learn to Play, is that our identity card, it will obviously mark where HQ is, but also it has ongoing abilities and has text on it. So specifically, Precision Design, or PD as a lot of people call it, has 2 ongoing abilities that we can use at any point in the game. They starts in play and it will remain in play. Firstly, we get +1 maximum hand size. That's just nice. That just means we can hold 6 cards in hand. So at the end of turn, if we have to discard down to hand size, we get to keep 6 cards. This means we get to hold more options so we can be a bit more flexible. And if we have an agenda in HQ, it's easier for us to hide it because if the runner's running HQ, it's a 1 in 6 to find the agenda if we're holding 1 as opposed to 1 in 5. So it's a bit harder to snipe in there. Now, secondly, it says whenever you score an agenda, you may add a card from archives to HQ. This text is always active. So while you will forget this a couple times in your first games, this is just really, really strong text. It basically makes every agenda to also say when scored, grab your best card from archives, put it back into your hand. And this is a very powerful card or a very powerful ability when it comes to the context of the HB card pool, which we'll be looking at in a second. This is a really big reason why we picked Haas-Bioroid, is we wanted to pick a deck that scores 7 points of agendas in a remote server. And Haas-Bioroid Precision Design has an ability baked in on it that kind of gives you a signpost and really directs you to score at points. So that's a big reason why we're playing this ability, because that is just really good text and we want to score at agendas. Because remember, at the end of the day, we're building a corporation deck that wants to score 7 points of agenda in a remote server behind ice with some defensive upgrades. So this lines up really, really well for us. Awesome. So we have our ongoing text. We know what faction we're in, so which cards we can play, the HB cards and the neutral cards. But also every identity has 2 very important numbers on the identity itself. And we're going to start with this number on the right. This 15 that's in the black circle, this important number is called our influence limit. Influence is this idea, it is a virtual currency of sort that we can spend during deck building to import cards into our deck from the other factions. So this is basically how we can get cards into our deck that aren't just HB and the neutral cards our opponent is expecting. So for instance, if we look at a Jinteki card, and this is Urtica Cypher, a really exciting card, it's an ambush, it looks like an agenda until the runner accesses it and finds out, oops, it's just a bunch of net damage. But this, as we said before, it's not an HB card, so we can't just inherently put it into our deck, we only play HB and neutral cards. However, we can spend influence to add Urtica Cypher to our deck. And you'll notice that just about all cards have this sort of 5-circle bar graph, either in the bottom left or the right side sometimes. And how many of these dots are highlighted marks how many influence each copy of this card costs. So every copy of Urtica Cypher, if we want to add it to a non-Jinteki deck, we have to spend 2 influence. And so because Precision Design, like all the other identities in System Gateway, has 15 influence, we have no problem playing a copy of Urtica Cypher. In fact, we could play up to 3 copies of Urtica Cypher for 6 influence. And this is the budget, this is the way that we spend our influence to bring cards into our deck from out of factions. Notice if we spend this, the 3 influence, it'll show up in our deck builder, and you'll also see 6 dots here in red to markate that we spent 6 influence from Jinteki to get this card in our deck. And this will update at the top that says we have 6 influence spent of our max 15, and we have 9 left available. Influence is really exciting, and it's one of the cool ways to bring some flashy cards into your deck. Whether you understand maybe what some of the weaknesses of Precision Design are, and then you want to bring some strengths from other factions to balance it out, that's always good and fun. Or whether you want to put some like very surprising traps and things that people don't expect. There's a lot of great ways to use influence, and it's one of my favorite parts, as most people's favorite part of deck building. Importantly, we have 15 influence. You don't have to spend all of it. In fact, you don't have to spend any of it, but you are highly incentivized to spend as much of your influence as possible. Because again, at the end of the day, not every corporation is good at everything. So if you want to spend your influence and say like, oh, Haas-Bioroid doesn't have a lot of card draw, let's bring in some NBN card draw cards. That's a great way to use influence to, again, help with some of the downsides inherently baked into every faction. Also, how much influence you spend, that's private information. You don't have to tell your opponent if you spent all of it or none of it. They are going to find out as the game goes on. But generally, influence, that's how you bring in cards from out of faction. You have 15 and you want to spend generally as much as you can. So you'll see most corporation decks will spend all 15 influence to bring in their favorite cards from out of faction. Now, the other number that shows up on every corporation identity is this number here in the white circle. And this 40, this is our minimum deck size. This is, again, it's the minimum deck size. That means that we cannot have fewer than 40 cards in our deck. Important, the identity doesn't count towards that deck size. So it's going to be not 39 cards and an identity. It has to be at least 40 cards, and then the identity is counted separate to that. Also, this is a minimum. It's not a maximum. You actually can put as many cards as you want into your corporation deck. I wouldn't advise to do that. And at some point, you functionally do run out of cards in System Gateway, so you are technically limited at some point. But that is just strictly a minimum. And generally in deck building, smaller deck size is going to be better. Important to understand, this is a rule in Netrunner, and this is not written anywhere on the identity itself or on any card itself. It's just in the rules, but it's important to understand that the amount of agenda points in your deck has to scale with the size of your deck. The bigger your deck gets, the more points you're required to put in your deck. If you're playing a 40 card minimum deck, you are required to play 18 to 19 agenda points within those 40 cards. The idea is that that is a ratio that the rules have described that says that's a healthy amount of points per card in your deck so that the game will be fun and move forward. Now, if you want to play a bigger deck, for every 5 additional cards you add to your deck, functionally you have to play basically what comes down to another agenda. So there's these breakpoints every 5 cards. So on 40 cards, you need 18 to 19 agenda points. Once you hit 45 cards, then you need to play 20 to 21 points. Once you go up another 5 cards and you play 50, then you need 22 to 23. And then for 55, as you might guess, 24 to 25. And then it goes on like that forever. So the idea is the bigger your deck is, the more points you're required to put in your deck. And hopefully that makes the game still pretty reasonable. Now, this number 40 minimum, 18 to 19 points. That is not written anywhere on the card itself. That's something that you're just gonna have to learn as you get into Netrunner. And is again, one of the big reasons why I like building our first deck on NetrunnerDB, because it will make sure that you're respecting that. So right now it's waiting for us to hit the minimum 40 cards. That's why it's red currently. And then once we hit that minimum 40, we're required to play between 18 and 19 agenda points. If you make our deck up to 45 cards, it'll say, hey, you need 20 to 21 points. And again, NetrunnerDB will do a great job at making sure your deck is legal at the end of the day, because it's technically not that hard to build an illegal deck list by having too many cards, too few agendas, or whatever combination thereof. Now, understanding these numbers, I just want to impart 3 best practices when it comes to understanding how big a deck should be and how many agenda points we should put in each deck, because we got a lot of different options. Firstly, rule 1 when it comes to deck building, smaller deck size is better. The smaller your deck is, the more consistent it is. This is largely true across most card games. The idea is that if I play a 40 corporation size deck or I play a 70 card corporation deck, the 40 card deck is just going to play better. It's going to be more consistent. We're going to have a better idea what we're going to be possibly drawing into. And at the end of the day, there's technically one best card in your deck. You'll just be drawing that best card more consistently when you just have less cards in your deck. So if you have a 40 card minimum deck, that's better than having a 70 card minimum corporation deck. So smaller deck size is better in most games, including Netrunner. Secondly, agenda points. Depending on the size of your deck, as we said before, you're required to play either 1 or 2 different numbers of agenda points. So on a 40 card minimum deck, it's either 18 or 19. Which of those do you play? And my guideline is always play the smaller number. So we don't play 19 agenda points ever. We always play 18 agenda points. And the reason is because there'll simply be fewer agenda points in your deck. It's honestly that simple. At the end of the day, the runner wins by stealing 7 points from the remote server and from central servers. And it is just that much harder for them to steal 7 points from 19 as opposed to 7 points from 18. If there's just less points, it's harder for them to find 7 of them. So if you can, always play the smaller number, and you should always be able to play the smaller number of whatever options are required for the size of your deck. Now, rule 3 can be a bit hard to describe, and it does technically go against rule 1, but is also very important and something you'll see across just about every deck you see posted on NetrunnerDB. And the rule 3 says that you want to keep in mind and lower your agenda density per card in your deck. To explain how this works, say that we build a 40 card corporation deck, and our 40 card deck is required to have 18 or 19 agenda points. And just as rule 2 dictates, we're going to be playing 18 agenda points. Say that we get 18 agenda points in our deck through 8 different agenda cards, which means our 40 card deck has 8 agendas. 8 out of the 40 cards in our deck are agendas, which means if the runner runs R&D as soon as turn 1 and accesses a random card, their chance of stealing an agenda is exactly 1 in 5. Because 1 in every 5 card in our deck is an agenda. It's 20% chance. That's not bad, but we can actually make it better. So remember that the amount of agenda points you have to put in your deck is dictated by chunks of 5. So a 40 card deck needs 18 or 19 agenda points, but a 45 card deck needs 20 to 21. However, a 40 card deck needs 18 points. A 41 card deck also needs 18 points. A 42 card deck needs 18 points. A 43 card deck needs 18 points. A 44 card deck still only needs 18 points. It's only once we add the 45th card that suddenly we jump up to needing 20 points. So the 45th card we add to the deck has to be an agenda. But this means that we can take the 40 card deck we have with 18 points in it, 8 agenda cards, and we can just add 4 non-agenda cards and bring the deck up to 44 card size. Now, instead of having 8 agendas in 40 cards, it's basically the same deck, but now it's 8 agendas in 44 cards. And just by adding 4 additional non-agenda cards to the deck, we have basically padded the deck and made it just that much harder for the runner to steal 7 points off of central servers. Again, now it's 8 in 44 as opposed to 8 in 40. So again, this does go a bit against rule number 1 that says small deck is better, but in short, you'll see any deck online, if it's a 40 minimum card deck, people will play 44 cards. If it's a 45 minimum corporation deck, which is actually very common, that's what most corporations look like. System Gateway has all 40 minimums. But if it's a 45 minimum corporation deck, you'll see most decks are 49 cards. And that's because everybody will build the smallest deck possible and then just add as many non-agenda cards as they can to the deck before they hit that next breakpoint that requires them to add more agendas to their deck. They don't want to add more agendas. They just want to add as many non-agendas as possible just to make the deck as non-agenda dense as possible. Those are the 3 rules. Okay, so rule 1, small deck size is good. 40 minimum is better than 70 minimum, so keep your deck small if you can. Second rule, always play the smaller amount of agendas. So if it's 18 to 19, play 18. If it's 20 to 21, play 20. And then finally, keep your agenda density down. So whatever deck you build the minimum deck size, and then just add 4 cards, your favorite non-agenda cards, just so the agendas are fewer and far between. So it's just harder for the runner to run central servers and steal 7 points. Now, what's both very frustrating and also a bit intriguing is a lot of these optimizations when it comes to how many agenda points you play and how many cards you play are not very obvious what they do to any given corporation game. The idea is that if you take a deck with 18 points in it, play a couple games, and then put it up to 19 points and play a couple games, it might not be obvious which one is the better deck over those couple of games, because it's really hard to tell. Different Netrunner games look different and things happen for many, many different reasons. Last year, I did a whole bunch of simulating. I wrote some software and I have a whole video talking about all this sort of stuff. And I ran a whole bunch of data that simulated how defensible different agenda suites are and deck sizes are. And I ran all those numbers. And all of these best practices that were already respected way before I did any sort of math stuff were proven by these numbers. And a lot of these decisions between playing 18 and 19 agenda points comes down to, on average, the corporation loses on central servers 1 turn slower. And that's actually really, really important. A lot of corporation games, a lot of Netrunner games come down to 1 or 2 turns. So these things are really quiet changes, which can be frustrating. So just understanding these and embracing them as quickly as possible, I promise you will overall build a better and more consistent deck in ways that are frustratingly very quiet and hard to observe in practical terms. Changing a card in your deck from card A to card B will be very obvious from game A and game B, but going from 18 to 19 agenda points, like, you might not notice it. But I promise you, behind the scenes, the math supports it, has some pretty big impact on some games. So do just keep that in mind. These are guidelines for a reason, and I promise you they won't lead you in the wrong place. Cool. Let's actually do some deck building. So I'm just going to clean this up really quickly. And we said we're building a corporation deck that the game plan is score 7 points in a remote server behind ice. So the first thing we want to add to our deck is agenda points. We're going to need, again, we're going to try and play a 44 card minimum deck. So we're going to need 18 agenda points, and let's add some agenda points to our deck. Now, the way the card browser here on the right works is whatever faction we have highlighted, it'll show us cards from those factions. And on this side, it'll show us the types of cards. So currently we're looking at agendas from the HB faction. And as we said before, we're allowed to play all the HB cards and all the neutral cards. And specifically when it comes to agendas, you cannot bring agendas in from other factions. So every HB deck can only play HB and neutral agendas. You cannot use influence to bring agendas in from other factions. Influence largely don't exist on agendas. Now, specifically when it comes to System Gateway, as you notice here, when we look at HB agendas, there's only one option. System Gateway has a small card pool, and the majority of agendas in System Gateway are actually neutral agendas. If we look here, it's mostly neutral agendas. That is just a wrinkle of System Gateway. Once you get to a bigger card pool, you'll play fewer and fewer neutral agendas. But for now, we're going to be playing a lot of neutral agendas. Every faction only has one agenda for their own faction in System Gateway. And that is Luminal Transubstantiation for HB. Every faction in System Gateway has a limit 1 per deck, 3/2 agenda. And without even reading the text on them, they're all quite good. One of them is okay, maybe, but all the others are very, very good. So any deck you play in System Gateway, it's very hard to find a reason not to play the limit 1 per deck agenda because it is pretty good. Luminal Transubstantiation, when you score it out, you get an additional turn. That's pretty good. It's really, really, really good, in fact. And we're going to play 1 copy of this because there's only a limit 1 per deck. Now notice we now have 2 agenda points. We're going to need 16 more. So this is where we have to go over to the neutral tab, which is underneath this sort of Netrunner Helix N. We'll just hide the HB agendas, and we have to make some choices here to put some agendas in our deck. And we have 4 neutral agendas. Our first one is Off-World Office. You definitely saw this in the Catalyst versus the Syndicate. This is a 4/2 agenda that when you score it, you get 7 credits. Universally, this is one of the best agendas in all of System Gateway because scoring a 2-pointer and getting 7 credits at the same time is just immense. When scored abilities that snowball you forward, if you're winning, you're going to win even harder. And at the end of the day, when we score with Precision Design, we can add our favorite card from Archives back to hand. So score 7, draw your best card is kind of sick. So we're going to play 3 copies of Off-World Office for sure. Now, before we add more agendas to our deck, we're going to stop for a second and look at our agenda suite because we know our win condition is to score to 7 points. And there actually can be a lot of decks you'll build as a newer player if you're trying to build a deck that scores to 7 points, that struggles to score to 7 points. It just has an awkward time to score to 7 points. And we're kind of on the way to build a deck that can be awkward to score to 7 points. And that's because our deck currently has 2-point agendas and other 2-point agendas. And if we build a deck that only exclusively has 2-point agendas, like say we add this 2-point agenda to it, we're going to end up with a deck that is just nearly impossible to score to 7 points. In fact, frankly, impossible to score to 7 agenda points, because no amount of 2-pointers scored gets to 7. Functionally, we'll have a deck that scores to 8 agenda points. And there's nothing wrong with scoring to 8 agenda points. If you win on 7, you do also win on 8 if you get there. But at the end of the day, if we want to score agendas to get to 7 agenda points and all we have is 2-pointers, we have to score 4 agendas. And that can be a bit more work. So all I want to focus here is whenever you're building a deck and your deck plans to score to 7, look at the agendas that are in your deck and you want to plan the map you have to score to 7. So we're currently with a deck that only has 2-pointers. We have a pretty long road to get to 7 points because it is in fact the road to 8 points. We have to score 4 separate agendas. And for that reason, if you find you're building a deck that has a bunch of 2-point agendas in it, you want to consider agendas that also have odd numbers of points on the agendas as well. Say for instance, this is send a message. And send a message is a 3-point agenda. And 3-point agendas actually really work well with some amount of 2-point agendas because we can score to 7 by scoring 1 3-pointer and 2 2-pointers. So instead of having to score 4 agendas and protecting 4 different cards on the table across the game, we only have to protect 3 different cards on the table for 3 turns, which is a fair bit easier over, the length of a Netrunner game. So for instance, a very common agenda suite that you'll see, and specifically and even in a bigger card pool, is an agenda suite somewhat like this, where the deck runs a lot of 2-point agendas and then some amount of 3-pointers, usually like 2 3-point agendas. Not only does an agenda suite like this get us perfectly to 18 by having 6 points and then everything else is 2 points, is that our game plan is to score a 2-pointer, score a 2-pointer, and then close the game off by scoring a 3-pointer. Now you can score the send a message second or first, you don't have to score it last, but the idea is that anytime you put together an agenda suite, you want to be able to plot out if you're going to be a deck that wins by scoring to 7 points, how are you going to get to 7 points? And some agenda suites that new players put together, they don't consider this and end up in really awkward spots where they're like, oh, if I score a 1-pointer and then a 2-pointer, then I have to score 2 more 1-pointers and then a 3-pointer. Like it can get pretty ugly. So you want to have a good idea what your game plan is to get to 7, and having some amount of odd point agendas, some of the bigger agendas, sometimes these are scary to put in your deck, can help a heck of a lot. So this is a pretty reasonable 18-point agenda suite, score 2 3-pointers, and then score a whole bunch of 2-pointers. However, this is orbital superiority. Aha! It is one of the other 2-point agendas you have in System Gateway, and it says when you score this agenda, if the runner is tagged, do 4 meat damage, otherwise give the runner 1 tag. Now, tags are a thing you've learned up in the Syndicate deck when you've added the booster cards, and tags can be pretty powerful. If the runner's tagged and you score this, you can win the game because you flatline them if they take 4 meat damage and they don't have at least 4 cards in hand. That is quite powerful. However, I'm just going to say this at the top, and we'll probably repeat this a couple times throughout this deck building video. Our deck is not going to care about tags. Now, this card is really okay in a deck that does care about tags, and let me tell you, the entire NBN faction cares a lot about tags. But in our Haas-Bioroid deck, I hate scoring this thing out because we just do not care about the text on it. So anytime I find myself with an orbital superiority in hand and I can score it, I often don't. I often say, oh, I'm just going to draw 3 or 4 cards and hope I find one of the 2-point agendas I'm actually excited to score out. And that's kind of a problem. So I'm actually going to suggest that we don't play orbital superiority. I'm going to get rid of these. So this is send a message. We barely talked about it, but it's a 5-3 agenda, and 5-3 agendas can be pretty scary for newer players because that in theory means the runner can win by running R&D. Oh, they stole 3-pointers. They run R&D. Oh, they stole a 3-pointer. Like it can get pretty bad pretty quickly. But that's kind of the beauty of send a message. It says when this agenda is scored or stolen, you may res 1 installed piece of ice ignoring all costs. So this card, there's a chance that the runner steals it on turn 1 and we can res an expensive 6 or 7 cost ice, and suddenly we're catapulted into the future. And the problem that we just had with the undefended R&D might be now super defended. And I kind of like that. Idea is if we also play a bunch of send a messages, we might be able to afford some more expensive ice and are okay losing a couple of these. But at the end of the day, what I'm just trying to say mostly is this thing isn't as scary as it should be. I think actually having some 3-pointers in your deck helps a heck of a lot, especially to get to 7. And we're going to try and embrace the send a message in this deck and play some expensive ice and hopefully get some of it for free. Off-World Office looks really good when it gives you 7 credits. It's not that hard for a send a message to get scored or stolen, and you res a 7 credit ice. So at the end of the day, one of them you don't even have to score out. Now, if we want to be running send a message and we don't want to be running any of the orbital superiorities, we can try running 3 copies of this, and that brings us to 17 agenda points. So not exactly at the 18 yet, but luckily there is a 1-pointer you can play in System Gateway called Superconducting Hub. When you score this, you can draw 2 cards if you want, and it gives you +2 maximum hand size, which gets pretty goofy because we already have 6 hand size. If we score one of these, we can have 8 hand size, and that is kind of wild fun. Now, as a rule, I don't like 3-1 agendas. They don't see a lot of play in Netrunner because it's just the worst amount of ratio to advancements versus points you get. You can play in a bigger format. There's a lot of 3-2 agendas you have. So for a 3-1 agenda to be that good, it's as much work as a 3-2, but less points. In fact, half as many points. So they don't see a lot of play unless their ability is pretty powerful. Now, Superconducting Hub, it doesn't have an immensely powerful ability, but we do just need 1 point in our deck because we want to play 18 or 19. And this agenda suite is only 8 cards. It's 18 agenda points, and we don't have to play orbital superiority, which honestly is the biggest success we could ask for. Now, we have to be careful. Looking at this agenda suite, can we score to 7? And yes, we can. Sometimes it does get a bit weird, but we still have that path of scoring 1 to send a message and then scoring a 2-pointer and then a 2-pointer. That works. We still have that classic 3-2-2 or 2-3-2, however you want to do it. We also have this Superconducting Hub, which can get a bit awkward. This means that in theory, we can score 2 send a message in a single Superconducting Hub. That gets you to 7. That's strange. But there are going to be some situations where the singleton Superconducting Hub gets a bit awkward. And that's mostly when we're on 5 points. Say that we score to send a message and we score an Off-World Office. Scoring the Superconducting Hub actually doesn't really help us. At the end of the day, it's not the worst thing because when you score it, you get to draw 3 cards functionally, one of them being your best card from archives. And that's kind of nice, honestly. But at the end of the day, being on 6 points versus being on 5 points doesn't matter. And this is what I mean when some people put together agenda suites and they realize like, actually, it's hard to score to 7 because scoring this doesn't often help us score to 7. It's just something that I think you're going to have to keep in mind when playing this deck is that if you can score the Superconducting Hub early, so be it. But if you're on 5 points, this is not something you need to score. Notably too, though, if the runner's on 5 points, them stealing the Superconducting Hub has no impact on the game whatsoever. They're always going to have to steal another point after they steal this. So that's also a really nice thing is that the conducting hub largely won't matter that much unless the runner steals exactly 2 copies of send a message, which just doesn't happen very often because of probabilities and stuff. But this is the agenda suite I think I'm actually going to try. And I think it's fun that we get to play 3 send a message and res some expensive ice for free, whether it's scored or stolen. We get the good 2-point agendas that we want to play. And hopefully Superconducting Hub is a bit easier to play when we're good at scoring agendas. And this does some good stuff for us. So this is the agenda suite we're going to play. And it's mostly exists because I do not want to play this because I really detest playing this outside of something that cares exclusively about tags. Once you get to a bigger card pool, it's very likely that you'll end up playing 2 send a message and then replace the 3rd send a message and the Superconducting Hub with 2 2-point agendas. But for now, this actually looks pretty okay, and I think will be a fun agenda suite. Now, before we go any further, we're just going to take a second here to look at the bottom part of the screen on the left that says card suggestions. This is a really cool part in NetrunnerDB that we haven't mentioned yet, but based off the cards that you currently have in your deck and based off of the card pool you have in your collection, this will suggest some cards that the NetrunnerDB deck builder thinks should be in your deck. Now, notably, this is not AI or anything. This is basically just saying a lot of decks that look like this also play these cards, and it shows us the most common cards that overlap with the deck we have built so far. What I'd actually recommend is if you go to the settings tab, you can say instead of show 3 suggestions, go to show 10 suggestions. This is a bit overkill when it comes to the small card pool of System Gateway, but it shows us some cards that we'll probably want to be considering for our deck anyways. And I think at the end of the day, we'll actually be playing every single card recommended here because System Gateway is relatively small. But noteworthy is that these 2 cards that are recommended at the top are cards that in System Gateway, whenever you're building a corporation deck, you can just go ahead and before you put any cards in your deck, add 3 copies of both of these cards. And that is these 2 cards, the first being Hedge Fund. We talked about this earlier. This is a neutral card, so every corporation can play it no problem. And Hedge Fund is just a click for 4 credit button. You've played this before when you played your Syndicate versus Catalyst. This card is just very good. It is a lot of money on a single click and very easily because it costs 5 credits, which can be expensive. You can play it on turn 1 if you open with this in your opening hand, which feels really good. Hedge Fund is just quite a nice card and just nice to get some neutral economy in your deck. A lot of decks struggle because they don't have enough economy, and this is just a very strong economy card. Just about every deck plays 3 copies of this, and System Gateway guaranteed you want 3 copies of this, but even in a bigger card pool, hedge fund is really, really common as a 3 of in just about every deck. Now, the second card is another auto include, and this is a new card you might not have seen so far. This is in fact our NBN card. This is called Spin Doctor, and this is an NBN card that is worth 1 influence. So if we want to play 3 copies of this card, and we do, this will be our first 3 influence we spend of our 15 influence, which we haven't touched so far. So this will leave us with 12 influence to work with. Spin Doctor. We could talk about Spin Doctor for an hour, but the short of the long is that this is one of the most flexible, creative, interesting, and much appreciated card you can put into any deck that you're building in System Gateway or even in the much bigger card pool. So Spin Doctor is almost always a 3 of. Firstly, Spin Doctor is an asset. You put it on the table. It looks like an agenda, so the runner might run it and get through ice and spend money. And you can just res Spin Doctor. Whenever you res this, you get to draw 2 cards. It's mandatory. You have to draw 2 cards, which means at the end of the day, if you just need more cards, installing Spin Doctor and resing it is more efficient than clicking to draw cards with the basic action. So it's just adding a bit of card draw to your deck. But the most important thing is this text. At any paid ability window, you can remove this asset from the game, so it disappears as Spin Doctor goes, to shuffle up to 2 cards from archives into R&D. So not only does this give you some nice recursion, which already our identity text has some recursion if we're scoring agendas, but the idea is that in the early game, if you played 2 hedge funds, you can go put them back in your deck. And by the mid game to the late game, you might draw those hedge funds again, and that's just more money that you appreciate. That's always nice. As much as, again, sometimes you want to leave your good cards in archives because when precision design scores, you can add those cards back to your hand. But most importantly, Spin Doctor is used very commonly to fix agenda flood. The idea is that if your hand is not good, either because it just isn't what you want, or say, heaven forbid, you've mulliganed and you're now holding 3 agendas in hand, Spin Doctor is the easiest card to be able to fix that problem. The idea is that you put Spin Doctor on the table, click 1, you res Spin Doctor, and you draw 2 cards. Then you can spend the rest of your turn, just draw, maybe draw again. And then when you have to discard down to your hand size, those agendas that you had, the too many agendas in your hand, feel free to discard them. Now, the runner, when they run Spin Doctor or when they run archives, before either of those runs are successful, you can remove Spin Doctor from the game at any paid ability window during a run and just say those agendas that you're running on archives, they're back in R&D. It just gives you safety. It actually puts the agendas in archives, so the runner has to run archives before they want to run R&D. Otherwise, 6 points can be functionally out of the game. It is just such a flexible card for so many reasons. The player expression, how you can use Spin Doctor, there's a lot to talk about with Spin Doctor. And I promise you, even in a bigger card pool, Spin Doctor more commonly shows up as a 3 of than even hedge fund does. And that's because there's more economy cards in the game than cards that do Spin Doctor stuff. Spin Doctor is very unique. You might not like this, but I promise you, the more you play with Spin Doctor, the more you realize how the paid ability instant speed stuff on Spin Doctor works. You're going to appreciate having him. But at least for the next little while, and probably for a long time to come, every corporation deck you're going to be building in System Gateway, and even in a bigger card pool, will start with 3 Spin Doctor and 3 hedge funds. So we can just do that now. Our game plan again was to score 7 points of agendas. We have those behind ice with some defensive upgrades. So let's worry about the ice thing. Now, ice, if we want to check that, that's this tab here with the shield. It is alphabetical. We'll hide the agendas, and let's look at every single ice we have in System Gateway by just highlighting every single faction there. It's about a dozen ice or so, not that many options, and now we got to decide which ice we want to put into our deck. So 2 basic rules when it comes to putting ice in decks. Firstly, there are 3 different kinds of ice in the game. There are barriers, they generally end the run, code gates that sometimes end the run and do weird things, and then sentries that rarely end the run but generally try and hurt or destroy the runner's stuff. They're pretty frightening. All 3 cards, all 3 types of ice have value. And generally, any deck you build should have some amount of each type of ice. The idea is that if you build a deck that's only barriers, the runner only has one problem to solve, which is go find their fractor. As soon as you introduce a second and third ice type, you're presenting different problems that the runner has to solve. Even if you only have a single code gate, if that code gate ends the run and that code gate hits the table, the runner now needs to find their decoder and install their decoder. That's extra clicks, that's extra credits. And so fundamentally, particularly in System Gateway, it really does serve you well to be playing ice of all 3 types. And generally, I like to have a balance of all 3 kinds, depending. Certain factions have better in-faction ice, so maybe we'll play more barriers in Wayland, maybe we'll play more sentries in Jinteki. That will come the more we see the card pool. But in short, we want to play some of each type because we want to be presenting many different kinds of problems that the runner has to solve. Now, second thing about ice, how much ice should we put in a deck? That's a common question that comes up. And the answer depends on the kind of deck you're building. Now, currently we're building that sort of archetypal, honest Netrunner deck, which is about scoring agendas behind ice. And in that sort of straightforward deck, I think a rule of thumb is you want slightly less than 1/3 of your deck to be ice. So we're trying to build a 44 card corporation deck. So we want somewhere between 13 and 15 ice in our deck. I think we'll probably end up on 14. In short, less than 1/3 of your deck on average, especially your first couple decks that care about ice, should be ice, less than 1/3. So for a 49 card corporation deck, which is also common outside of System Gateway, you'll end up on somewhere between 15 and 18 ice, generally around 16 usually. Now this can change. Again, rules are meant to be broken. Once you get to a bigger card pool, you'll see in organized play Netrunner, there's decks that run 0 ice. There's decks that run 22 ice. So there's reasons to do everything. But on the average, like archetypal, I'm going to score stuff on ice, we're going to be about a bit less than 1/3 of the deck. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to go through each type of ice and look at all the barriers, add a couple. Look at all the code gates, add a couple. Look at all the sentries, add a couple. It's simply that straightforward. Because all we want to do is we want to add about 14 ice to the deck, and we want to get some of each type. So why not just go from type to type to type? Now, this is the first time we're going to look at this bar here again. This bar, you can type in the name of any card and it'll show up. That's really nice if you know the names. But you can also use this to do some searching. Specifically, the searching on NetrunnerDB is really powerful. It might be a bit overwhelming, but I promise you we'll keep it as simple as possible. The idea is that you can type little syntax of operators and operands to be able to filter the card pool to whatever you want. If you want to know more about this tab up here, I'll open in a new tab. It's called syntax. And this can show you all the things you can search by advancement cost, by cycle, by faction, by illustrator. You can look at this if you want, but all that we really need to remember is S searches subtype. S for subtype. So we can do S : and simply type barrier, and it'll show us all the barriers. If all you can remember in terms of syntax searching is the word S or the letter S for subtype, S : will get you there. We can always find all the barriers by just doing this. And here, there are 4 different barriers in System Gateway. We're going to be playing some of them. Let's see how many we can play. We're going to go a bit extra here in this video. It's already a bit long. It's going to get a bit longer for sure. But we're actually going to look at all of the ice and figure out what ice is good and what ice isn't good when it comes to System Gateway. Good is a bit of a nebulous term, and it's important to understand how people evaluate ice in Netrunner. And largely, ice is evaluated on 2 different axes. Firstly, how good are the subroutines? If the runner runs into unresed ice and you res it and then the subroutine fires, how impactful is that on the game? This is Palisade. All Palisade does is end the run. That's a good enough subroutine in a lot of cases. It's not going to change the game. It's not going to change how the runner plays because they're not scared of Palisade. But if we look at something like maybe, I don't know, a ballista that can trash a program, this might impact how the runner interacts with you. So understanding how strong the subroutine on an ice is has an impact on how good the ice is in theory. Now, the second thing you look at is the break cost of the ice. I think a lot of people look at subroutines and think, oh, that subroutine is so scary. Oh, the runner's going to get really messed up when they run into my Karuna and take maybe 2 net damage. But at the end of the day, for half of the Netrunner game, just about, the runner will not let subroutines resolve. They will be breaking the subroutines by using the icebreakers they put in their deck. So by generally turn 5 to turn 6, where the runner has their killer and they can break the subroutines on the Karuna if they want to break the subroutines on the Karuna, the value of Karuna comes down to a much less sexy mathematical question. The idea is, on average, how much does it cost a runner to break a Karuna? And hopefully, we want that number to be as high as possible. There's certain ice that are relatively similar to one another, but if one just costs more to break on average than the other, that's probably the better piece of ice. And we're going to be able to look at that, because luckily, System Gateway is really small. So we're going to be able to understand what possible ways runners have to break certain ice in our deck. So we can look at something like a Palisade and see like, is this a good ice? Are runners going to spend a lot of money to break this? And I'll show you what this looks like. Again, this might be a bit extra for the sake of building a new deck, but this shows you the sort of processes I go to when I build a new deck. And specifically when it comes to System Gateway, that's such a small card pool, this is kind of a treat. Now, in a new tab, I'm going to be opening this section here called Sets. And Sets shows you all of the cards in Netrunner. This allows you to explore through all the cards. It is in release date order, so the Liberation Cycle is the latest set, and we want to be looking at System Gateway. I'm going to click on this here, and it'll open up and show us the System Gateway cards. Specifically, View as Checklist, I'm going to go in here and say View as Images. You don't see my drop-down menu. I'm just going to re-hit Search, and now we'll just see all the card text. And specifically, we want to look at what are the ways that runners can break barriers in System Gateway? Because there's only 2 breakers for each type of ice. There's only 2 fractors. Let's just look at the fractors. And just as we know before, we're going to append to the System Gateway search. If we do S for subtype, colon, and then we type fractor, and fractor is the subtype of cards that break barriers. This is not a name that you have to know at any point in time playing Netrunner, but it is something you'll learn eventually. Fractors are the cards, the types of programs that break barriers. If we search this, we get to see there's only 2 cards in System Gateway that can break barriers, or there's technically slightly more, but these are the ways that most runners will be breaking barriers. It's 2 programs, Cleaver and Marjana. And we're not going to read all the text on these cards, but the short of the long is we're going to look at these and see if there's some pattern we can kind of recognize and whether we can find a way to get good value out of that pattern. And let's look at these breakers. This is Marjana. It's really cheap. It comes in at very low strength. It's 1 plus 1 strength, and then it breaks subroutines for somewhere between 2 for 1 subroutine and 1 for 1 subroutine. But very importantly, this is very low strength, which means if we can present a high strength barrier, Marjana is just going to have to pay a lot. No way to get around that. So say we have a 6 strength ice, Marjana is going to pay 5 credits to start and then even more for subroutines. So let's just remember that. High strength barriers seem to be good against Marjana. Now looking at Cleaver, it's actually very similar. Cleaver comes in at 3 strength, which is a bit better than Marjana, but if you want to boost Cleaver strength, it's 2 credits to get a +1 strength. That's expensive. Same ideas. If we have a 6 strength ice, you're going to have to spend 6 credits to boost 3 times. That's very expensive. Otherwise, Cleaver breaks 1 for 2 subroutines. That's very good. But it looks like both of these fractors struggle not to break the low strength stuff, which is really cheap, but to break the high strength stuff. And that's all I want to do here. By looking at the cleavers, or sorry, looking at the fractors, we can see, oh, in System Gateway, it looks like high strength barriers are pretty good. And that's all we need to know. And we'll go back to our NetrunnerDB page and continue building our deck, knowing that big barriers are good. And by big, I mean high strength. And luckily, we get a start here. This is Brawn 1.0, quite the barrier. This is an HB card, so we can play as many copies as we want without spending any of our influence. It's a barrier. It's also a Bioroid. Bioroid is a subtype that has existed for a long time in Netrunner, and it represents the sort of Haas-Bioroid Bioroids. They're sentient kind of robot characters, AIs as well, that exist both in physical meat space and in net space. And Bioroid specifically often has this clause at the top because they can be, the runner can basically reason with them and spend time talking to them. And that's sometimes a way to circumvent some of their subroutines. So for instance, Brawn costs 6. That's relatively expensive. As a rule, I think ice that costs 0 to 2 credits is cheap. 3 to 5 credits is like mid-range. 6+ is pretty expensive. So you want to keep that in mind. You don't want to have a deck that only has expensive ice because you'll run into problems. But Brawn is definitely an expensive ice. It's 6 strength and it has 3 subroutines. That's a lot. The bottom 2 end the run. That's good. You want your barriers to end the run generally. And then the first subroutine says you may install 1 piece of ice from HQ or archives. Behind this, ignoring all costs. That's just a nice subroutine. It's nice that it doesn't only end the run. So if the runner face checks into this and that subroutine resolves, you get some good value from it. But this is a beefy piece of ice. Now I mentioned Bioroids. Bioroids, runners can always reason with them without having to spend credits or programs by clicking through the subroutines. And that represents that you're reasoning with the Bioroid and talking with them. And sometimes that's a nice way to bypass the sentient security. So most 1.0 Bioroids have this text that the runner can always lose a click to break a subroutine on this ice. The runner can use this ability. So even if the runner has no breakers, click 1, they can run and they can say click, 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 and they get through the Brawn. That's a downside to the Brawn. But at the end of the day, they spend their whole turn breaking 1 of our ice. It still seems pretty good. Now, Brawn passes our check wildly. It is 6 strength, which means Marjana pays 5 credits just to get up to strength, and Cleaver pays 6 credits just to get up to strength, let alone has to break some of these subroutines in both cases. That seems to be the best case when it comes to barriers in System Gateway, and it is. High strength barriers are really good in System Gateway, and Brawn is no slouch. Now, Brawn is what I would call an anchor ice, and it is a very important ice that we want to put on our remote server, and it will anchor our remote server. It will be the big taxing thing that we'll be putting our agendas behind turn after turn and scoring out. Because it is really hard to deal with a Brawn turn after turn after turn because it's really taxing whether you want to spend credits or you want to spend your whole turn clicking through it. I think it's important to understand a bit about ice placement when it comes to ice in general in Netrunner. This is a lesson I think a lot of earlier games in System Gateway corporations can lose by putting their ice in wrong positions. And I think it's really important if your deck cares about scoring points in a remote server behind ice that you have one or two good pieces of ice that you're always going to put on the remote server because it's hard to score behind a 2 credit piece of ice. You want that 6 credit, that 7 credit piece of ice to score behind, because at the end of the day, that's pretty taxing. So brawn is quintessentially the first brawn that we draw. We almost always want to put on the remote server. The second brawn that we draw, we can consider also putting on the remote server, but that second brawn, maybe we'll put that on whatever central server is the least defended or where the runner is putting on the most pressure. In System Gateway, you'll often find out that the server that you often lose to is actually R&D, because if you have a good remote server, there's not a lot of HQ pressure in System Gateway, so you can take your agendas and put them in the remote server. They don't often stay in HQ if you have a good remote. So these are what I call the anchor ice. These are the ice that we're happy to draw as soon as possible because we want to get one on the remote server as soon as possible, because that will be what we begin to build a remote server on. Brawn is a very, very big thing. We're going to be playing 3 copies of Brawn. That's expensive, and rightfully so. 6 can be a lot. It can be expensive to res as soon as turn 1. That can be most, if not all, your money, but that's actually something we have to keep in mind, is that we're playing 3 copies of Send a Message. So we're kind of incentivized as soon as possible to get our expensive ice on the table, even if we can't afford to res that or don't want to res them, because if the runner does run R&D, runs HQ, and steals a Send a Message, immediately we get a free brawn, and that's all we need to start snowballing forward. So just having more expensive ice, we can probably afford in this deck, on the basis that we're playing 3 copies of Send a Message. Brawn seems really good. 3 copies. Let's start there. Next up, it's Palisade. Now, Palisade is a neutral ice, so everyone can play this. You don't spend any influence. It just ends the run, 1 subroutine, as a lot of barriers have. It's only 2 strength and it costs 3. So not a great ratio of strength to res cost compared to Brawn, which is pretty big. But it says while this ice is protecting a remote server, it gets +2 strength. So on a remote server, this Palisade, we pay 3 credits. It's a 4 strength ice. That's pretty good. We looked at the fractors, and Marjana, if it's on the remote server, has to pay 4 credits to break this. That's pretty good. And then Cleaver has to boost awkwardly above 3 strength and break this on a remote server. It also costs about 3 credits. That's pretty good. The runner breaking a single piece of ice for the cost that you res the ice is just as a rule pretty good. If I spend 3 on Palisade, the runner breaks it for 4, like you're kind of winning there. That's a really good trade because you res it once and the runner probably has to break it 2 or 3 times, depending where you put it. Now, notably, I like Palisade because it really shows you where you want to have this ice. I almost never like putting this ice on a central server because it's pretty bad on a central server. On a central server, most runners will break this for just 1 credit, as opposed to putting on a remote server where they break it for like 3 credits. So this is another card that we want to put on a remote server, maybe before or after the Brawn, to really get that scoring server nice and robust and have some taxing barriers in the way. I'm going to put 2 copies of Palisade because we already have some barriers in the deck. I don't know if we need 6. Let's just put in 5 barriers for now. We might add more, and then we'll address the numbers later, depending on how many cool code gates and sentries we run into. Now, there's only 2 more barriers in System Gateway. This is Pharos. It's a Wayland card. It costs 3 influence, 3 circles here. So every copy we put in, we really have to consider it because that is a lot of influence. And it's a 7 cost barrier. This is the most expensive ice in all of System Gateway. Now it comes in at 5 strength, which is still not bad. We talked about high strength barriers being pretty annoying into both Cleaver and Marjana, and it has 3 subroutines not too dissimilar to Brawn 1. The first 2 end the run, and the first one gives the runner a tag. Tags are annoying, but we inherently don't care about tags. They still can be annoying, but whatever. Now it says you can advance this ice, and if we advance it at least 3 times, it becomes a 10 strength barrier. Real talk, 10 strength barrier in this format in System Gateway is a nightmare to deal with. There's still ways for runners to deal with big, tall ice, but when we looked at Cleaver, we looked at Marjana, they break Pharos for like 12 credits, 13 credits. I don't know what the number is, but it's really, really big. The runner never wants to do it. So Pharos is looking pretty okay. However, Pharos, what it does functionally is actually very similar to what Brawn does. It is an expensive barrier with multiple subroutines, and we already have 3 expensive barriers with multiple subroutines. It's actually a very similar card. Brawn and Pharos are kind of similar. Now, the beauty of Pharos is that they can't click through the subroutines because it doesn't have that Bioroid tag, which is largely a downside. But at the end of the day, the thing that Pharos does, this deck already is able of doing, which is making some annoying barriers and putting them in the way. So for that reason, I don't think we'll actually put Pharos in this deck. But do keep in mind, Pharos is a very, very strong card in System Gateway. And if you find out the more you play this deck, the barriers are even better than you thought they would, you could easily put a Pharos in this list. It is expensive at 7. It is the most expensive ice in System Gateway, and there's a chance with 3 Send a Message we'll get 1 res for free. But at the end of the day, I'm not excited to play Pharos because it does the same thing Brawn does, as much as it potentially is a bit better than Brawn on some board states. Now finally, we have Ping, and Ping is the only kind of ice like this in System Gateway, which is a small, low strength barrier. Now, ping simply ends the run for 2 credits with 1 strength, but when you res this ice during a run, you give the runner a tag. Now, I'm going to say this a couple more times during this video. Our deck does not care about tags. NBN does care about tags. NBN loves tags, in fact, and ping is an all-star in any NBN deck or any deck you're building that cares about tags inherently. We do not. Now, this card is going to be cheap to break. Inherently, both Marjan and Cleaver break this for 1 credit. Now, that's very different than the Brawn re-res or even the Palisade we res for only 1 more credit. A lot of decks will break Palisade for 3 credits every time, as opposed to the ping being broken for 1 credit every time. And obviously the tag is doing some heavy lifting here, but I just want to emphasize the point that this ice is often what people call a gear check ice. Sometimes you hear the term a binary ice, and these ice actually have a fair bit of value in the game of Netrunner, besides being a taxing mathematical proposition over a longer period of time. The idea is that this ice needs to be broken with a fractor or some way to get through this. And so in the early game, where we don't have a lot of money potentially, this can be one of the most powerful ice. The idea is that we can install an agenda behind the ping as soon as turn 1, afford to res the ping, and probably still score at the agenda, and that can snowball us forward. A lot of times these are called gear checks because they're just checking whether the runner has the appropriate gear. Come back when you find your cleaver. Come back when you find your fractor. That is worth something in this game, because in the early game, the runner probably doesn't have all the solutions to the problems we're presenting. So you'll see a lot of decks that have some amount of gear check ice, these cheap ice that you want to rush out behind quickly, because does the runner have their solution? They probably don't by turn 1. Specifically, card draw and system gateway is not that strong on the runner side. So them having the answer, even if they need to get it down, sometimes they just don't have the clicks in a single turn. All I'm trying to say is that certain cheap ice like this has a lot of value across a lot of different kinds of decks. We're not going to be playing it specifically because we don't care about tags, but anytime you see a little cheap ice and think, oh, that's garbage, I could just play more for the Palisade, there are actually there's a lot of value behind small gear check ice just to rush out before the runner can get set up. I think 5 barriers, that's good enough. Let's look at what the code gates look like. And so again, we're going to filter that. We're going to do S and we'll just type code, and that will just show us the code gates. There are fewer code gates in system gateway than there are barriers. I'll say this at the top. Code gates are my least favorite part of system gateway by a mile. There's just not a lot of options, and I think all the options are a bit too similar to one another that I'm not excited about them. And we're going to start just the same way we looked at the barriers. Let's go over to the tab we have with the sets, and let's look at all the decoders that we have access to understand how expensive some of these cards are going to be to break over a long enough period of time. These are the 2 decoders in system gateway the runner has access to. That's the trend. There's always 2 for each type. There's also neutral breakers, AI breakers, and ways to cheat around ice. We're going to ignore those for now, but there's 2 breakers. On the right, we have Unity. Unity is the shaper option, and it comes in at 1 strength, and it gets better the more code gates you have installed. The idea is the first Unity boosts 1 for 1 strength, but as the game goes longer, eventually the runner will have all 3 programs installed, which means the Unity will be up to 4 strength for a single credit, which is pretty good. But that's kind of a shaper thing. They get better the more time you give them to install cards. So early game Unity, not great. Late game Unity gets to 4 strength really, really quickly. So not too bad. On the other side, we have Buzzsaw, and Buzzsaw is very similar to the Cleaver we saw before. It comes in at a fixed 3 strength. But if you want to boost the strength, so any code gate that's above 3 strength gets a lot of value because it costs a lot of money to increase the strength. 3 credits for a single strength is nonsense. So anything that we can find that's a 4 strength or a 5 strength code gate will tax out Buzzsaw very, very meaningfully. Otherwise, Buzzsaw breaks 1 for 2 code gate subroutines, which is pretty good. So here, if we're expecting Buzzsaw, and I do expect a lot of Buzzsaw on system gateway, we need to find code gates that are above 3 strength because otherwise they get broken for 1 credit. Now, going back to our options, we have 3 options. This is Diviner. This is the Jinteki option. For any copy we want to play, it costs us 2 influence, as you see down here. And Diviner is a 3 strength code gate. Not a great start. That means Buzzsaw will break it for a single credit. Luckily, it's pretty cheap at 2 credits. And this card says to do a net damage if you trash a card that has an odd cost to end the run. Turns out in System Gateway, there's actually more odd costs than even costs, so this should happen more than 50% of the time. But this is 2 influence for a code gate that probably gets broken for a credit as soon as the Buzzsaw comes down and doesn't always end the run. I'm not too excited about that. It's not where I want to spend my influence. It's not a great code gate. The fact that it's less or equal to 3 strength is pretty bad because I expect a lot of Buzzsaw, and eventually this gets broken for 1 credit. Now, we talked about how gear check ice are worth something, and this is just not my favorite gear check ice because it doesn't consistently do the thing that gear check ice wants to do, which is end the run. That cheap pink, it always ends the run if they don't have the right program. This ends the run 55% of the time, which is not really the sort of place I want to be risking my early agenda behind. Now, admittedly, net damage does matter. Getting good cards out of the runner's hand can be important, so net damage is worth something. That's a cool face check, but I'm not excited about this for our deck so far. Let's see if there's better code gates to play. Next up, I'll jump to the neutral option, which is white space. And white space, at least it's neutral, so we're not spending any influence on it. It's also very cheap at 2 cost, which is nice. It's 0 strength, so it largely only matters how many subroutines are on this thing because everything's going to break it. It doesn't have to boost strength. It just pays for subroutines, and it has 2 subroutines. The first is the runner loses 3 credits. That's a messed up subroutine. That's really, really good. And then if the runner has 6 or fewer credits, end the run. So it doesn't always end the run, and most code gates in System Gateway don't always end the run, but this is at least a bit better. The early face check into white space, if the runner doesn't have their decoder, it's going to hit them hard. You pay 2, they lose 3. And then generally in the early game, if they lose 3 credits, they'll probably end the run because they'll probably have 6 or fewer credits. Now, as the game goes longer and the runner has their breaker down, most folks will break this for a single credit because all you have to do is break this subroutine. Because if the subroutine doesn't resolve, you probably will have at least 7 credits, and then this subroutine can resolve and we will not end the run. So this ice still is in that sort of gear check spot where in the early game it's impactful. It might end the run. It might steal 3 credits or lose 3 credits more accurately. It's okay. It's not my favorite with such a code gates and System Gateway. Now for now, I'm going to put 3 copies of this in the deck because we want to play some amount of barriers, some amount of code gates, some amount of sentries, just because it means that the runner has to find their decoder, and that's worth something. I'm not excited about it, but so far the best code gate we have. And the last code gate we can play for 2 influence per pop from the NBN faction is a code gate that cares about tags. I don't care about tags. We don't care about tags. It's worth noting that Funhouse is annoying. It is just genuinely an annoying card in System Gateway, no way you slice it. It's expensive to break. However, they can always go through for 4 credits, but this text is really good if you care about tags. And unfortunately, we don't. So I'm just not going to consider this, but this is a really good card in a lot of decks in System Gateway, not this one potentially. And that leaves us with 3 copies of white space, and that's it in the code gate slot. And I'll be honest, that's probably fine. At least we're running some amount of code gates, but as I said before, System Gateway code gates, not my favorite by a mile, but at least we found some code gates. The sentries are a lot more fun. Now, finally, let's look at the sentries. Same idea, S: for subtype, we'll type in sentry, and we see 4 options. That's nice. We might find something better here than the code gates for sure. And the same way that we started with the barriers or code gates, let's just go over to our sets tab and look at the ways that runners can break our sentries. The type of programs that break sentries are called killers. So that will search in there, and there should be 2 options. These are actually much more interesting options. If you ask me, they don't always have the same downside that we saw in all of the fractors, for instance. On the right, we have Echelon. Similarly to Shaper, they scale the later the game goes. Echelon comes in with additional strength for every installed icebreaker, including itself. So in the early game, it's low strength. In the late game, it's high strength. And in the early game, this thing is actually really bad at boosting its own strength. It's 3 credits for 2 strength. So early game, if they only have the Echelon down and you have a 2 or 3 strength sentry, they have to spend a lot of money boosting the strength. So we'll keep that in mind. In the mid game, this will probably be 3 strength. So anything that's 4 strength above, it's still going to be annoying to the Echelon. That's good fun. The criminal version is Carmen. Carmen you see pretty commonly. It's pretty expensive, but if you made a successful run, it comes down to cheaper. And Carmen comes in at 2 strength already. So anything lower than that, they don't have to boost. Now, Carmen boosts 3 strength for 2 credits, which is not bad at all. So that means anything 2 strength or fewer, you don't have to boost. Anything above 2 strength, you'll have to at least a minimum pay 2 credits and then subroutines. So as a corporation, we're going to keep that in mind. Anything that's 3 to 4 strength probably will be annoying for both of these breakers for at least the majority of the game. And that seems to be the sweet spot for sentries currently in System Gateway. Now, our first sentry option is on Cell 1.0, the HB card, so we're spending no influence. Now, this is a Bioroid, so the runner can always click through subroutines. It does cost 6 credits, which is pretty expensive. We already have some expensive ice in the deck, so we just want to make sure we don't overdo it here, and hopefully the send messages do help on both sides of the table. It's also a Destroyer, which is a common subtype for sentries. That means it wants to destroy trash, generally the runner's programs or installed cards. Notably, this is the champ design card in System Gateway. This is from the 2018 European champion, Patrick Gower, or Rotom Appliance, and that is his likeness on the card himself. And just as a fun fact, 3 years later in 2021, when System Gateway came out, Patrick won the 2021 World Championship with a System Gateway-based precision design deck, not too dissimilar to what we're building right now. Obviously, there's a much bigger card pool because it was in the standard format, But this idea of the deck we're building together is a very consistent and very powerful build. So System Gateway, for being a learn to play the starter product, there's some very strong cards in it. And this deck is probably going to be no slouch either. So anytime that you're at a loss, you think your deck is struggling, there's an inner Patrick we can tap into, and I promise you, we can get some good results. Now, subroutines on this ice are really, really mean. The runner can always click through them, even if they have no installed breakers of any type, but the first subroutine trashes an installed runner card. That's any card, doesn't have to be a program. Usually it will be, but trashing hardware, resources, all that stuff is really good. You may install one card from HQ or archives as a nonsense powerful ability. And then finally, the runner cannot steal or trash Corp cards for the remainder of this run. What's wild is that last subroutine, functionally, it does not end the run, but all the runner can do is look. They can't steal, they can't trash. So if you ask me, that's often just as good as an end the run subroutine. And in some ways, even a bit more obnoxious, kind of rubbing it in when they see the agenda in the remote server and they can't steal it. This card's really good. It's very expensive. The runner can click through it. And to some extent, having more Bioroid ice in your deck is better, because if the runner wants to click through the on-sell, they can't click through the Brawn 1.0 behind it. There's only so much clicking they can do on the turn, so Bioroids do work well with other Bioroids. Notably, this is also 4 strength, which means that Carmen has to boost, and at all points in the game, largely you're going to have to spend credits boosting on the echelon as well. We said 4 strength was really good, 3 subroutines is really good. This looks like a Brawn version Sentry, and we kind of like it. That's some really mean subroutines. Now, notably, I'm not going to play 3 copies of On-Sell. I'm only going to put 2 copies in the deck. And that's because these subroutines are not amazing on turn 1. Like, rezzing an On-Sell on turn 1 is, again, as we said with the Brawn, can be very expensive, but it's not actually the anchor we want on the remote server. Because as soon as turn 1, if the runner just face checks and just runs in onto HQ, which I do think a lot of runners should be running as much as possible in System Gateway, this first subroutine doesn't matter on turn 1. This second subroutine sometimes doesn't matter on turn 1. So we don't want to be in a situation where we're holding this ice as consistently in our opening hand as possible, and it's just not a great fit for it. So I'm going to play 2 copies of this card so that we eventually find it when we need it. Now, let's finish off the sentries. If we notice our numbers here for ice, we have about 10 ice so far. I think we want to play somewhere between 13 and 14 ice, so we have to add a couple more sentries or go back and add a couple more code gates. We'll sort it out, but we're currently on 10 and we want somewhere between 13 and 14. Next up, I'm going to go to the neutral option because we don't have to spend influence on this. And so if the neutral card is good, that's a lot easier for us. And this is Tithe. I love Tithe. Tithe is sick. Tithe only costs 1 to res, which is an absolute bargain. It has 1 strength, which functionally doesn't matter for any of the sentry breakers in System Gateway. And it has the AP subtype. AP stands for anti-personnel. It's pretty common on sentries. It means that's going to try and hurt the runner. And it has 2 subroutines, do 1 net damage, and the corporation gains 1 credit. Those are annoying subroutines. And I really like Tithe because at the end of the day, it teaches you a lot about Netrunner. Firstly, if we res this for 1 credit and the runner wants to run through this and wants to break the subroutines at some point with the breaker, they're going to play 1 to 2 credits to break 1 to 2 of these subroutines. Sometimes the runner will let this subroutine resolve. Often the runner doesn't want this subroutine to resolve. Sometimes they can. But at the end of the day, if we pay 1 credit and they pay 2 every time to break it, that's just the value. There's no way around it. In fact, a lot of times you res this for free on a face check when this fires and you get the money back. Immediate mail-in rebate. But very importantly, Tithe is what I would call not a gear check ice, not an anchor ice. This is what I would call a taxing ice, an annoying ice. And you generally want some amount of taxing and annoying ice in every single deck. Not all ice in your deck needs to end the run. So far, basically every ice has functionally ended the run in our deck, but it's actually nice to have some cards in your deck that don't end the run. And that's because ice that doesn't end the run generally have more annoying subroutines and can be a fair bit cheaper. This is a Palisade. And say we put a Palisade on R&D, we're paying 3 credits for a 2 strength end the run, which most icebreakers we're going to see in System Gateway can easily break this for 1 credit on R&D. That's not great. And so it looks like we're paying a premium. We're paying a 3 credit premium for an ice that gets broken for 1. And that's because it can end the run. End the run, that text, you pay extra for that privilege. And sometimes you do need end the run ice. In theory, if you're scoring agendas in a remote server behind ice, you want some amount of that ice to end the run because that generally keeps the runner out to some extent. But on central servers, you don't always need the run to be ended. You just need running central servers to be annoying. For real, just annoying can be enough. Now, when it comes to the economy, Tithe doesn't end the run, so it is a steal. You pay 1 credit, sometimes you get that 1 credit back, and you have an ice that always has relevant 2 subroutines on it. Now, of course, they don't end the run, which is why Tithe is as cheap as it is, but the runner, if they want to break these subroutines, they're spending 2 credits every time they go through this, or something bad is happening to them, or something good is happening to you. Now the remote server, where we're scoring agendas, this is not a great ice I would put on the remote server. This is a taxing ice, an annoying ice. I'll put this on central servers. And so the remote server will have agendas in it. And if the runner knows there's an agenda in the remote server, if they can feel it, they can run through tithes, no problem. They can afford to take a net damage. They can afford to give the corporation a credit if they are stealing an agenda for that run, right? That's a pretty good trade for them. Now, while the agenda in the remote server on some terms is guaranteed, the agenda on top of R&D or the agenda in HQ is never guaranteed. If we look at most of the decks we build, like the deck we built right now, the agendas in R&D, it's about one agenda in every 5 cards. So the idea is the tithe on R&D, if the runner has to break it for 2 credits, if they feel like they have to break it for 2 credits, just to have a 20% shot for an agenda, or say we're holding one agenda in our hand on most corporations, it's again a 20% shot in an agenda, that adds up. You often don't need the premium and the run to pay extra from it when you can get an ice that's more annoying, that's more expensive to break, because the runner has to run through that server more than just once to steal the agenda. On average, they have to run R&D 5 times to find a single agenda, and so you get more value by finding something that doesn't end the run, but something that the runner feels like they still have to break. It's an interesting thing. Again, sometimes you don't need to make R&D bulletproof, you just need to make it annoying enough. Now that technically also is true for the remote server. The brawn on its own is not bulletproof. The runner can always click through it, but you can tell in some turns the runner can't afford to click through it, and that's where you can put an agenda. But tithe on R&D, tithe on HQ, that it can make it just annoying enough where the runner can't just check it every turn because it doesn't make sense either to let the subroutines resolve, or it doesn't make sense to break it because it is very expensive for something you resed for next to no money. Equally tithe, love it on archives. There's a lot of successful run triggers across the system gateway cards where runners can get value from running archives, and getting an end the run on archives is kind of nonsense when you can be even more annoying and cost the runner even more credits potentially by just putting in tithe. I'm a big fan of tithe, and I think it teaches you a lot about the game, where it's not about making everything totally locked down. You don't need to make Fort Knox. You need your remote server to be good if you're scoring agendas. You just need to make central servers annoying, and then annoying can win, and it usually does. I'm going to play 3 copies of tithe because tithe is sick. Now, our last 2 sentries are both from out of faction. The first one here is the Wayland Ballista. It reses for 5, which is in the expensive enough camp. It's 4 strength, which we said is pretty good. And its single subroutine says trash one installed program or end the run. Those are both good. It's unfortunate we have to choose. So either we destroy something nice and the runner goes through, or we end the run and the runner gets to keep their valuable program. I think for 2 influence, this card is actually kind of similar to what Ancel does. Now, admittedly, Ancel has basically both of those subroutines on 2 different things. Trash an installed runner card, and the runner cannot steal or trash cards. That's functionally an end the run if you ask me. And having more subroutines is just more annoying. We pay 1 more for this, but these cards are very similar. I don't think I'm excited to play Ballista when we have already a card in our deck that does something similar. Now, the final sentry is Karuna. This is a Jinteki sentry. It's an AP, so it's trying to hurt you. It comes in a 3 strength, which, as we said, is actually pretty good. It means Carbon will have to boost and pay credits, and the Echelon won't cut through it until it's really the late game where you have all installed icebreakers. And there's subroutines. The first one does 2 net damage, and the runner can choose to enact Mercy and Jack out. Otherwise, if they don't want to, that's going to be 4 net damage to go through the Karuna with no breaker. Now, I want to be very clear here. This is not the best card for the deck. We don't care about net damage the way that some Jinteki decks can build entire decks that care about damage, and cards in hand can be incredibly lethal. We will eventually be building that deck in the series, but it's not this deck. So we're playing this just because it's annoying, not because it's a win condition potentially in our deck. But this also reminds a very important part about building the best optimal Netrunner deck is sometimes you just need your deck to be slightly fun. And I think Karuna is pretty neat. I think a lot of people won't expect this in the HP deck, and when they're checking as aggressively as they can, making those early runs, this can be quite impactful. Sometimes taking 2 cards out of hand is all you need. So I'm going to play a copy of Karuna because I think it's kind of neat. I want to be very clear. This is just the spice I chose to put in the deck because, again, influence is a fun system. You don't have to do this. You can put whatever 2 influence card you want in the slot. Hopefully an ice could work. You can put 1 funhouse in the deck, and there's actually a big chance that that 1 code gate with a tag will give the runner some second guessing about how much the tag is worth in your deck. Secretly none, but at the end of the day, you need to make sure your deck is fun and I think Karuna is a really nice card. The numbers on it are not bad. The face check is not bad, and it's just a nice enough sentry that's a fair bit cheaper than playing the 3rd copy of Ancel. And with that, that takes us to, I think, 14 ice there. Yeah, that's 14 ice, which is kind of exactly where we want it to be. Slightly less than 1/3 of our deck is ice. We have a mixture of barriers, code gates, and sentries, which is exactly what we want it to be. Our sentries, we have a fair bit. Our barriers are really good. And finally, our code gates are kind of how they are in System Gateway. But at the end of the day, not a bad start. And this takes us to step 2 checked off of our 3-step plan, which is score agendas. We got those. Behind ice, we have that, with hopefully some defensive upgrades to bolster that. So let's take a quick look at the defensive upgrades. Notably, we're already at 28 cards, so we're more than halfway there. We should be able to pretty simply be able to close this deck off. So to look at the upgrades, I'm going to clear that search term. And instead of the ice, I'm just going to go to the upgrade tab, and we only have 4 options, 1 for each faction. We'll start here with the HB option because we have to spend no influence on it. So these are easier to include. And this is Managarm Skunkworks. This is a unique upgrade. It costs 2 to res, 3 to trash. Anytime you see a card that you spend less resing it, more the runner trashing it, that's often good for you as a corporation just because they spend more than you do. That's a deal. And it says whenever the runner approaches the server, end the run unless they either spend 2 clicks or 5 credits. Now, this is a nonsense powerful defensive upgrade. And this was a one of in the Syndicate deck if you were lucky enough to find it. It's a very powerful card. Specifically, whenever the runner approaches, this can be often misunderstood. This means when after the runner has passed every single piece of ice and they're just about to breach the server, you can ask, do you want to breach? And they say yes. And then you res this. And then they have to deal with this text before they find all the cards in the remote server, let alone this. They have to do this tax before even being able to trash the Managarm Skunkworks. So the idea is the runner runs a remote server, they spend all their money, they spend all their time clicking through Bioroid subroutines, and right before they access, you res the Managarm for only 2, and now the runner has to spend 2 clicks, which they might not have if they click through the Bioroid, or 5 credits. After they pay the 5 credits, then they breach the server, then they get to see if there's an agenda in there. Yeah, they might steal it. And then after paying that 5 credits, then they have to consider trashing this for another 3 credits. So just in the very easiest terms, you pay 2 credits for Managarm, the runner pays 8 after breaking some ice. It is just an absolute steal, and is one of the most powerful defensive upgrades HB has in the format right now. Managarm Skunkworks is really great. Now, notably, it is a unique card, which means we can play as many copies as we want in our deck, but we only can have 1 resed on the table at a time. That doesn't mean you can't install 2. It's just as soon as you res the second one, if the first one is already resed, it immediately gets trashed. So you can spread them out. Just remember, you can only have 1 resed at a time. I think Managarm Skunkworks is just so good that we just want to play 3. It's one of the best things we can put our remote server as soon as possible, because even in the early game, if we can afford to res this for 2, the runner has to get through the ice and then continue to pay this additional tax. Either a lot of money up front, which protects the trash cost of the Managarm, or if they have to click through this, it's harder for them to click through our Bioroids, and we have about 5 Bioroids in the deck. It's about 1/3 of our ice, so we value that a heck of a lot. We'll play 3 of these. It's just so good. Great trade. Now, our other upgrades, we have Amaze Amusements. This is an NBN card. I'm not going to read the text on it because you notice what? It says the word tags on it. We don't have to read it anymore. Then we have this Wayland card, Malapur Data Vault. It's an upgrade that says whenever you score an agenda from the root of this server, you may search R&D for a non-agenda card and reveal it, add that card to HQ. This is just a nice card. It's good in combo decks that have these like 2-card combos. There's some good reasons to play this card in the format. This card is 3 influence, so if we want to put it into our deck, we have to have a really good reason. And this ability is actually kind of very similar to our already identity ability that says whenever we score an agenda, we may add a card to archives from archives to HQ. So this might be overkill. It's doubling down on the thing we're doing already, so not my favorite include. And then we have Anoetic Void, which is a 4 influence card. It's a Jinteki upgrade. Again, 4 influence is a heck of a lot. It's unique. Res is for nothing, trash is for 1. So, okay, a bit better than the res cost. And it says whenever the runner approaches a server, you may pay 2 credits and trash 2 cards from HQ. If you do, end the run. This might be the first time you've seen this card. This was not in the Syndicate deck. And this is genuinely the strongest defensive upgrade, almost in the entire card pool, above including System Gateway. This card's wild. Again, it's if the runner approaches, so they have to get through all your ice. And once they get through all your ice, as long as you can res the Anoetic Void, which costs nothing, and as long as you have at least 2 credits and 2 cards in hand, you can just say no and end the run. There's no choices. There's no additional cost the runner can play to force you to do it again. They just have to run it back. And at the end of the day, if the way to running it back is clicking through a brawn or breaking it for 8 credits, they probably can't do it. So they pay 8, you pay 2 and 2 cards, and the run is going to be ended. Notably, this card needs cards in hand. Trash 2 cards from HQ is an expensive cost on top of the 2 credits, but specifically Precision Design, we have a 6 hand size. So we're actually really good at playing Anoetic Void, better than some Jinteki decks. And there's a chance with a Superconducting Hub, we might even have 8 cards in hand, which is some nice synergy there. Now, also notably, notice this says when the runner approaches the server, do something, and Managarm Skunkworks has the same text. When the runner approaches the server, end the run in less. Now, these cards have the same timing window, which means because they're both your cards, you can choose the order. So if you have in a remote server a Managarm Skunkworks and an Anoetic Void, res both of them. and then say, runner, do the Managarm first. And so now the runner has to decide to pay 2 clicks or 5 credits and say they do. Then you resolve the Anoetic. And after they've already paid for the Managarm, then you just pay 2 credits and trash 2 cards. So the runner has to pay for the Managarm and still they get thrown at the server. This card is very powerful and arguably a lot of newer players, I think, find this to be immensely unfair. There are downsides to it. It is a very expensive card to fuel. I would recommend if you're struggling against the Anoetic Void, run the remote server when there's not an agenda in it. So it's more expensive for the corporation to protect it if you can afford to get in. But this card is just nonsense powerful and is the strongest defensive upgrade you can put possibly into any deck in System Gateway, let alone add a bigger card pool. For that reason, we're really going to use our influence on this. We're actually going to spend 8 by playing 2 copies. Because at the end of the day, if we can get Anoetic and Managarm in the same remote server, it is mostly bulletproof. It's very hard for the runner to contest that server as long as we have a modicum of money and enough cards in hand. Notably, that's 13 influence, so we still have some influence left over. So we already have some big spends here, but this is what influence is for. So if we want to spend it, so why not spend it on one of the most powerful cards in the remote server? Now, that finishes all the upgrades, and I think we actually have solved everything we wanted to solve so far. We have our agendas, we can score 7 points. We have our ice is really good, and we have some of the strongest defensive upgrades in the entire game. So our game plan is now just making sure we have enough money, getting those cards in the remote server, and scoring them out. Now, I just want to take a second as a reminder, you can score cards in a remote server without Managarm, without Anoetic Void. I think it's going to cause some bad habits potentially where you're just sitting there waiting to get your Anoetic, waiting to get your Managarm. You can score out on a remote server with no defensive upgrades, with 1 defensive upgrades. You don't need these. These cards are very, very good, but just make sure you're not building habits where you're waiting for the remote server to be bulletproof. You don't need bulletproof. The goal of Netrunner is not to make a remote server that's impossible to run. You're trying to make a remote server that the runner can't really run or is not expected to run. So if you put a single card on a remote server, the runner might think, oh, that's a spin doctor, or oh, that's an asset that we have yet to add to our deck. You don't need to make it bulletproof. Sometimes good enough is good enough, and just make sure that you're not waiting for the Managarms, you're not waiting for the Anoetic. If you have a scoring window, as the more you play the game, the more you'll recognize what these windows look like. Capitalize on it if you have it. Don't wait for everything to come together, because sometimes you don't draw the 2 Anoetic Voids. Hopefully you do. We spent a lot of influence on them. It'd be bad if you didn't. All right. To finish off the deck, we have 33 cards. We need 11 more card slots, and we're just going to run through all the card types we haven't looked at. We've looked at agendas, we've looked at upgrades, we've looked at ice. So why don't we look at operations? And I'm going to start by just looking at the HB and the neutral stuff, because that's the stuff we can play in our deck, no problem. 3 hedge fund. Great. We're playing 3 copies. That's how we started. We need this. It's economy. Now, next up is Seamless Launch, and you might have noticed here in the card suggestions, it's been screaming, please play Seamless Launch for a while now, and there's a big reason. This might be one of the most powerful cards in all of System Gateway, and it's a very innocuous card. For a single click and a single credit, we put 2 advancements on a card that was not installed this turn. You've probably played this and enjoyed this already in the Syndicate. This card not only is a soft economy card because it gives you 2 advancements for a single click, a single credit, but this allows you to score really, really aggressively and play a very fast, never advance game is what it's called. The idea is that with a Seamless Launch in hand, you can put an off-world office in the remote server, and you don't have to pre-advance it. You'd often for 4-2 agendas, people will do install advance, and then on the following turn, they'll do advance, 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 score. That's a common scoring pattern for 4-2 agendas. But with Seamless Launch being a 3 of in the deck, you can just install the off-world office, not advancing it. So now the runner can't tell, is that an asset? Is that an agenda? Is that an upgrade? And then on the following turn, you just do Seamless Launch for 2 advancements, advance, advance, and then you score it. And then with the precision design ability, you return the Seamless Launch back to your hand. Very powerful card. It means any card on the table, unadvanced, can threaten to be any agenda that you can score out. With 2 Seamless Launches in your hand, any agenda, a 5-3 you can put on the table, even without ice. The runner might think it's an asset. They don't run it. They think it's a spin doctor. And then on your next turn, you do Seamless Launch, advance, and you score a 3-pointer. This card is just low-key, incredibly powerful. There's no way we're not playing 3 of them. It is one of the most common cards you will return to your hand with your precision design ability, and it just makes scoring agendas so fast, so cheap, and so easy. Very easy 3 of. Next up is Sprint. Sprint is a card that I think a lot of newer players really do enjoy because it gives you some flexibility to carve your hand. It draws 3 cards, and then you shuffle 2 cards back. It doesn't have to be cards that you've drawn, just any cards into HQ. So if you don't like your hand, get a different hand. This doesn't give you card advantage. It gives you card quality because you play a card to draw a card to lose 2 cards. You come out just about equal, but it is a card that smooths a lot of decks. And I think overall, as you get more reps in with this deck, the less sprints you can play. It's not the fastest card for what the name is named, funny enough, but it is a nice smoothening card. Specifically, if you have an ugly hand, it can get you out the same way that Spin Doctor can, but it's a bit less aggressive. It's a bit less on tempo. We'll play a single copy. Maybe we'll play 2 copies. We might change that, but Sprint is definitely not bad. From this point, we only have a couple card slots left and only 2 influence, so let's just jump over to the assets to see what assets we have access to without spending any influence, because we only have a bit of influence to look at. Next up is Regolith Mining License. Notice that's the next card suggestion, and rightfully so. This is another card that arguably in all of your System Gateway only decks will be another 3 of. And that's because every deck that you have built probably could use some more money in it, and Regolith Mining License is a neutral card, so no influence spent, that has 15 credits on it. You res this for 2, and if you can get 13 credits off of this over a bunch of clicks, it is just a lot of money. A lot of times your game plan is step 1, empty a Regolith Mining License behind ice, step 2, jam your agendas, just because that is the money you're going to need to res all your ice, to res your upgrades, to afford all the stuff you're doing. So early Regolith is like the best thing you can put in a remote server to survive, and then the next turn you can take 9 credits off of it, or take 6 credits and then put a piece of ice on the table is a very common game plan. The runner has to trash this for 3 credits. They can't let you have 15 credits if they find it, which is pretty great. Regolith is very commonly a 3 of in a lot of System Gateway decks, and even outside of System Gateway sees a fair bit of play. So we'll play that. That's fantastic. The other card we can play here in HB is Nico Campaign. And Nico Campaign is an advertisement. It loads credits and then it survives 3 turns, and every turn it gives you money and it ends by giving you a bit of card draw. This card's really good. Now, notably, it has a low trash cost. So runners, if they find this, they will trash it. So this is generally a card that you want to ice up, because if you just put this on the table without ice, the runner will trash it. Now, equally, you do want to ice up your Regolith Mining License because it has 15 credits on it, and that's a lot of money. But this is another card that needs to go into the remote server. Now, I'm not actually sure how many copies of Nico we want to put in the deck, because this deck really wants to continually put stuff in its remote server and might not be that great at building multiple remote servers. A lot of times this precision design deck will only run a single remote server, and then you always want to be putting something in it that you either threaten to score out or you get the money off quickly. So things like agendas into Regoliths. Nico takes that remote server up for 3 turns, and that actually might be a bit slow for this deck. Now, notably, System Gateway is a bit of a slower format than I'm used to, so maybe we can get away with just this ticking down over a couple turns. But I wouldn't be surprised that if we play 2 copies of this, over time we realize, having this in the remote server for 3 turns is a bit longer than we want it to be when we have a Regolith in hand or an agenda that we want to jam right away. I think there's a chance we can end up playing a single copy of this, and if we find it, it's good, but I'm kind of worried the remote server is going to be a bit busy over most of the turns of the game. Let's cut down to 1 copy and see how we feel. Now, at this point in time, we've gone through all of the HB and all of the neutral cards. So you see here, all of these cards we've looked at and we've considered. So now for our last 3 cards, we either have to add more copies of cards we've already decided to play fewer copies of, or we have to spend our influence. And we actually do have 2 influence left over. And so figuring out how to spend that 2 influence, that shouldn't be too hard. And an easy way to do this is, let's just look at all the cards. So we've already seen all the ice, so we don't have to look at all the ice. We've already looked at all the upgrades, so we don't have to look at all the upgrades. And so now let's hide the HB and neutral cards and just look at the Deteki, the MVN, and the Wayland cards. This might seem overwhelming, but we can really easily go through all these cards and see what they do. And very notably, if you click on any of these categories, so eyes for influence, we can sort these cards by influence. And so now all the low influence cards are at the top, and these are the cards that we probably want to look at. We don't really want to look at a 3 influence card because we only have 2 influence left over in our deck. So let's try and look at these cards that we can consider playing with our 2 influence left over. Let's start here with Urtica Cypher. We looked at this card before. It's an ambush. It looks like an agenda, but it's not an agenda. And unfortunately, this card's a bit anti-synergistic with our game plan in HB, because we don't often do install advance, which is what Urtica Cypher wants us to do. We're more likely to do install and on the following turn, seamless launch advance. So this probably doesn't work out that well for our deck. I don't think this makes a lot of sense. Next up, for 2 influences, Public Trail. This card cares about tags. Bye now. And then from this point on, we only have 1 influence cards. Spin Doctor, we're playing all the copies we can. Retribution, this card trashes programs and hardware. If you have a tag, we don't care about tags. Now that leaves us with 3 other cards, and they're all very interesting because they're all kind of generic 1 influence splashable cards that give you some amount of economy and some utility, which we generally like that a fair bit. At the top here is Government Subsidy. It's a 10 cost card, one of the most expensive cards in System Gateway, and it gives you 15 credits. So functionally, it's a click for 5 credit button as long as you have the money up front. And that's not too bad. I'm not sure how often we're going to have that much money. We're a bit aggressive at jamming in the remote server. We don't want to play too slow. And a lot of times the Wayland decks can be a bit slower, just kind of buttoning down, advancing their card and getting money. So it's an option. Now, similarly to that, we have Hansei Review, and Hansei Review is also a 5 credit econ card. It's a lot easier to play. It only costs 5 credits, so you can play it on turn 1, and it gives you 5 credits, but you have to discard a card from HQ if you have any. Now with 6 hand size, that actually might not be that bad. We probably should have a worse card in hand we're not too worried about parting with. However, we also have to keep cards in hand to some extent because we do have Anoetic Void, and Anoetic Void needs cards in hand. So there's some tension there for sure. With a 6-card hand size, I think Hansei Review is entirely playable. Now our last option is Predictive Planogram, and before we dismiss this because it has the word tag on it, notably it's a totally fine card without even the tag text. Either we play this to gain 3 credits, which is less than 5, that's for sure, but it costs 0, so we can play it on any board state, or we can draw 3 cards. Card draw is actually really few and far between in System Gateway, and specifically with Predictive Planogram, it's easy for us to draw 3 cards because we have a 6 hand size, so we can hold those cards, hopefully without having to discard any extras. If the runner is tagged, which largely shouldn't happen, we can do both of these at the same time. That's an absolute treat if that happens. But even on its own, this card's not so bad at all. Now, I think there's multiple correct answers here. I think I'm most likely to either want to play Predictive Planogram for some flexibility for either credits or cards, whatever we need on each board state, or Hansei Review because we have 6 hand size and we can get rid of our worst card, no problem. It'll probably be the white space in the mid game where the runner has their breaker down. But I think both of these are fine. I think I'm gonna go for Predictive Planogram because I just think card draw is pretty neat. I like having options and we have 2 influence, so why not play 2 copies? And this brings us to 43 cards. All our influence is spent. We have 18 points, which is exactly what you want. And as we said before, we're trying to get 44 cards because that is the most amount of cards we can play without being required to play more agenda points. So now without any influence left over, it's largely just adding another HB or neutral card and looking at our options here. I think we probably just add that Nico campaign back in and have 2 copies. And that's our deck. I think we're done. Now, the final thing I like to do before I save my deck with a cool deck name is if you go to this check tab at the top, once you mash a number here and hit reset a couple times, this can simulate some card draw. So as a fun little activity, I like to fishbowl a bit and draw some opening hands and see if they're any good. And if they're good, kind of say, how would we play this opening hand? So if I hit 5 here, the question is, would we keep the starting hand? And my answer is, yeah, it's a pretty good hand. Mandatory draw, we draw the 6th card, that's a white space. And so the way that I would start this is I'd probably play my Brawn on the remote server. We talked about having the Anchor Ice. I'd probably play my Hedge Fund because that's good money. And here I'd probably ice up R&D because that's where all our agendas are and we need to draw agendas to win the game. So I'd likely put the white space there. Maybe I'll just put the tie there and put the white space in front of the Brawn. From this point forward, yeah, we're going to draw some ice, we're going to draw some money, and our first agenda will be a send a message that hopefully we can sneak through the Brawn, maybe with the Anoetic Void, and cheaply with the Seamless Launch. Not too bad. So you can do this a couple times and see if the hands are any good. This hand's also totally keepable. We have our early Brawn, we have our early economy, a defensive upgrade, the first agenda if we want to push out. This one, we'd probably push it a bit sooner. If this gets stolen, it's okay. We get a free Brawn. And you can do this to test a couple card draws and see what things look like. Would you rather have this, or would you rather mulligan and have that? So you can give yourself a couple test tries there before you get this card sleeved up in paper or on Jinteki.net. Now, once you're all done, you can scroll to the bottom here and give yourself a new Corp deck name. Also, this is a nice time here to go through the card suggestions and see if there's any card that you might have forgot that could have been just a total hit in your deck itself. I think we've actually looked at all these cards because, again, System Gateway is relatively small. The next cards that I'm recommending is Government Subsidy and Hansei Review. No surprise, those are the last options we also looked at. If you want to get those into your deck and cut the Karuna for a 3rd on sell, that could work as well. But once you've gone through all that, give yourself a deck name, something clever, and just hit save. And from that point forward, your deck should appear in your My Deck section at the top left. From this point forward, you can view, you can edit, you can duplicate, you can delete, you can export this in Jinteki.net format if you want to bring this on JNet, but that is our first HB Corp deck here in System Gateway, 44 cards. I think this deck is probably quite good. And again, it's actually relatively similar to the deck that won the World Championship in 2021 with Onsell 1.0's face on it as well. But I think this is a very strong fundamental corporation deck. And you still have a lot of flexibility here to make the deck work the way that works for you. So for instance, if you're struggling with card draw and drawing some bad hands and you don't know how to play out your hands too easily, cut the Nico campaign, cut one for a 2nd sprint and have a bit more flexibility to control your hand. If you don't like the send of messages, maybe you can cut down to 2 and then play those orbital superiorities and have a terrible 4/2 in your deck. That's fine as well. But there's a fair bit of flexibility, and having as small as a card pool as you do have in System Gateway, I find actually really empowering when it comes to deck building. Because while there are options, it's actually very approachable to be able to move around some cards in very obvious ways. Do we need the planograms or would we rather have the Hanseis? Those are 1-for-1 swaps. If we just need a bit more money, a bit less card draw, it's very easy to pursue that and see how things go. And enjoy Tithe. Tithe is something special. And with that, hopefully you have some strong understanding of how I look at deck building when it comes not only to System Gateway, but just in general. where it's basic rules when it comes to deck size, agenda points, densities, how much ice we put on our deck. Have a strong game plan, build around your game plan. We knew what we wanted to do when we started the deck, which is score points in a remote server with some defensive upgrades. Defensive upgrades are really good. Our ice is really good. This is going to be a great deck, I think. Now, in the next video, we'll be back and we'll be building a runner deck. We did build our Corp deck first. I think that's actually an easier way to start deck building because I do think corporation decks are bringing the problem to the table and runners have to solve the problem. So knowing the problems that we built today, in the near future, in the next video, we'll have an idea of how we solve that problem with our System Gateway runner deck we'll be bringing in the next video. Again, if you have any comments, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to hit me up in the YouTube comments below. Excited to read them. And of course, if you want to take a second to drop a like on the video, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you're enjoying some System Gateway. Ciao. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Now, that turned out to be a bit longer than I was hoping it to be, but there is a lot to talk about when it comes to building your first ever deck in System Gateway. Now, this is just the beginning of a series. Video 2 will be coming out hopefully next week. We'll be building our first runner deck, and then we'll be revisiting and building different archetypes across both the Corp and the runner side. And you can build some pretty wild stuff, tags mattering, damage mattering, at least on the Corp side. Again, that's pretty fascinating for only being 41 different Corp cards in System Gateway. Also, we're probably going to sneak in some gameplay. Building the deck is one thing, playing it is another. So once we build our first ever runner deck, we'll have some gameplay up on the channel where we play our Learn to Play Corp deck versus the Learn to Play runner deck and focus on some fundamentals, which I think is also going to be hopefully appreciated. Let me know if that's not or is the case. Speaking of appreciated, thank you so much to all these names here and more. Here at the Métropole Grid, we're supported on Patreon. And all these names, and of course our daily cast Patreons, allow me to put the time into video content like this. Live streaming, we stream twice a week, and all the video editing and all the motion graphics, the stuff that happens behind the scenes, it just would not be possible. So huge thank you to all these names here and more. If you want to support the Métropole Grid, you can find a link to Patreon just below. And with that, we're going to continue through our deck building series. We're also going to get back into making other content on this channel. It's been a while since After Worlds. Things have really cooled down. We'll get some deck dives and just try and put out at least a piece of content a week, hopefully a bit more on top of the streams. And I'm looking forward to that. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in a bit. Ciao.